One of the surprising side effects of the pandemic is returning to a much more normal state. We're talking about the price of lumber, which skyrocketed earlier this year, much to the shock of consumers and builders. The CBC's Jeannie Lee is on the story. So, Jeannie, what happened to finally end those high prices?
Well, you know, there's a saying on the markets, Andrew, and that's the cure for high prices is high prices. So if you think about it, at some point people are going to say, hey, I just can't afford this. And if enough people say that, well, that's what happens to start the fall of those wild prices. Now, adding to this is the fact that back in the early pandemic, you remember that nobody knew what the future held. So producers of all kinds of things actually cut back on production in many cases in order to not have a glut of things that would be unsold later. And that's exactly what happened with lumber. So if we take a look at this graph, you'll see what I mean. That in the early part of this year, prices were bumping along. They had gone up a little bit as demand started to rise for people who wanted to, add additions to their homes or even build a deck, etc. And that demand kept going up. Meanwhile, it was colliding with the fact that producers had cut back so much on production so that in the spring, boy, did prices take off to that peak that you see there. It turns out, in retrospect, you always see the peak, and that would be on May 6th when the price of 1,000 board feet of lumber hit $1,700 US. But then look at how things just fell off a cliff, to the point where now, today, we're looking at $660 for the same amount of lumber, and that brings us all the way back to the beginning of the year again. So we could say that if there was a bubble in lumber, and it looks as if there was, it has totally burst, so that people now are paying what they were paying back in the early part of this year, and they may not have even noticed that rise to the skies.
So what does this mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, it means that anyone who had the unlucky timing of needing lumber at the very moment of that spike, say in April, May, boy, they were stuck with massive bills. And in fact, there was one estimate by home builders, a home builders group that said the cost of lumber alone, never mind other materials which were also going up in price, the cost of lumber alone was adding something like $25,000 to the average price of a new home. So those people, if they were stuck and couldn't get out of their contracts, had to pay. Now, a lot of people postponed plans or also canceled out on other plans, which then, of course, increased the supply of lumber, which also helped bring down prices. And so you see, that's how a market works, is that sometimes when things go way up too soon, then they do correct. And we've seen that happen now with lumber.
And what other news, Jeannie, is playing out on the markets today?
Well, inflation of another kind, and that would be just general cost of living inflation. We got the latest figures from the US, but this has been happening in Canada as well, where this whole wonky relationship between supply and demand, a lot of supply or less supply because of the supply chain disruptions, a lot of demand brought on by the pandemic for all kinds of things that we didn't know we needed so much of. They collide and then end up raising prices, so that you have this 13-year high in the U.S. inflation rate, which is affecting markets somewhat at the moment. So we're seeing a bit of nervousness creep in. TSX Composite here at home holding on to a small gain of 47 points. The Dow Jones and the S&P 500, though, down. They were up earlier, so a little bit of nervousness that maybe this 5.4% rate of inflation could be less than transitory, shall we say, a little bit more permanent perhaps, although not as high as perhaps 5.4%. Now, look at the Canadian dollar. The impact on the dollar is that with the prospect of, inflation going up, you also have the dollar going up because interest rates might go up. So the Canadian dollar has dropped in relation to that, under 80 cents US. West Texas oil still up there. Talk about inflation there. $75.23 a barrel. And gold also a little higher today, holding well above the $1,800 mark. Andrew?
Thanks, Jeannie.